Please be seated. Thank you. Well, it's really been a heck of a symposium, I think. I'm really glad to be here. I hope you all learned something over the last couple days. I know I certainly did. My name is Russell Moss. I teach grape growing at Pscheidt, and I represent Sunridge Nursery here in Oregon as well. So today we're going to talk about powdery mildew. And I was thinking about my experience with powdery mildew. First of all, I always like to ask this question in a room with a bunch of grape growers. Who here has ever had powdery mildew? Nobody, right? Yeah, no one's going to raise their hands. No one's ever had powdery mildew. So when I was going to college in New Zealand, we went to a grower in Marlborough, and he said, there's no reason to ever have powdery mildew. And then I remember my first powdery mildew outbreak, and I thought, I don't much care for that guy. So obviously, sometimes it's really unavoidable, and in the instance where I had it, it was certainly unavoidable. It was a coverage issue, which Andrew Landers will talk about today, where we got frosted early season, about a foot of shoot growth. The tips burned, the laterals pushed, and we didn't have the finance to do the remedial canopy management that was needed, and we didn't get the right coverage, and we lost a crop. So this session comes off of 3 kind of high-pressure powdery mildew years. So obviously in 15 and 16, there were big field failures to frac 3 and frac 11. And then we still saw, even when we removed frac 3s and 11, we still saw quite a bit of powdery mildew in Oregon, which may have something to do with coverage. So this, I think, couldn't be more timely. So today we've really assembled kind of an all-star cast here to help sort us out. So we're going to start with Dr. Michelle Moyer. She's an associate professor and viticulture extension specialist at WSU Prosser. She researches everything grape-related, everything under the sun, pest management, canopy management, freeze. And she's going to talk about the biology of the disease. And then we're going to go to Jay Pscheidt, who really, I think, none of these people, I think, need introduction to you, but Jay has been with OSU since the late 80s as a professor and extension agent and plant pathology, specializing in all fruit diseases. And then followed by Andrew Landers, who we've had to bring out of retirement for this, just freshly retired from Cornell, literally wrote the book on vineyard spraying, effective vineyard spraying, which I'm sure all of you have. And actually, Andrew will be giving a full-day workshop tomorrow at Pscheidt's McMinnville campus from 8:30 to 3:30. If you haven't registered for it, I think we still have some spots, very few, and it's in both English and in Spanish. So with that, I'll get out of the way and let Michelle kick it off.
All right. Thank you. So we are aware that the laser pointer might be a little bit hard to see, so I'm sorry if I start, it goes on the wall. Sorry for the AV guys if I shoot you in the face there. So today I'm going to start or kick things off with talking a little bit about biology. We have 3 very, very short sections to kind of essentially give you a 30,000-foot view of all these topics, and hopefully there's time for Q&A afterwards to kind of delve in a little bit deeper if you guys wish to do so. And so I'd like to start a lot of my talks off with this slide. So many of you guys have seen this before, and this kind of highlights the fact that biology, or understanding how things are actually working in the vineyard, really does lay the groundwork for what we do and how we do things later on, whether it's related through the chemistries we select or related to the technologies that we use to use those chemistries. But we really do need to understand that biology in order to effectively time those other components of the system. And so for the rest of this talk, which again will be relatively brief because we only got 30 minutes here, we're going to go through the disease triangle. We're going to go through each component of that. So for those of you who've taken Plant Pathology 101, the disease triangle is just used to help identify how disease actually progresses in the field. You would be very surprised at the number of times that we ask in introductory classes is what causes disease? No, it's rain, or it's this. It's, well, that doesn't cause disease. It's a component of it. And so today we'll be talking a little bit about the pathogen, so the powdery mildew fungus itself, and there we go. We'll be talking about the host, the grapevine, and we'll also be talking how the environment will influence the components that builds up for disease. So first, let's talk a little bit about the pathogen and how that influences disease development. So you guys know powdery mildew, you've seen it before, hopefully not to this extent, but it can get this bad. And powdery mildew is a disease with a mission, and that main mission is to essentially kind of live in harmony, if you will, with the host, but it didn't evolve with wine grapes, didn't evolve with Vitis vinifera. And so that harmonization or that living while not killing the host is not something that it's quite accustomed to. And so the powdery mildew fungus, as you guys can see here, it tends to only affect green and growing tissue. It does not infect bark per se, or dead leaves, dead tendrils. And it grows entirely on the host's surface, and that's what you see in this lower left picture. And so that factor alone, the fact that it's entirely, with very few exceptions, on the outside of the leaf is really how we can use a lot of the environmental components and canopy management to really control this particular pathogen. What makes this disease, though, exceptionally difficult, and we'll talk about it in a couple other slides, is the fact that it produces these little conidia. And those little conidia, it's one per day is produced on those little stalks that you see, and an individual colony can have 30 of those stalks, and those things can produce spores for up to 30 days. So it can very rapidly build up in your vineyard, and that's the kind of the unfortunate nature of this particular disease, is it starts off slow, but it very, very, very quickly, very similar to compound interest, will build up and explode in your vineyard. I'm sure many of you guys have experienced that, where things are going fine, and the next thing you know, you walk out the door and, oh my gosh, didn't look like that yesterday. And so that's very typical of this type of disease. The way this disease starts, in most cases, I know you guys also have another form of overwintering called flag shoots, but the dominant formation or dominant way the disease overwinters in this form of Cleistothecia or Chasmothecia. So these are very, very well adapted overwintering structures that can survive pretty much any type of environmental condition. Deep freezes, we've even stored them in -20s freezer, -20 degrees Celsius freezer, no problem. -80 is a little bit more of a challenge, but they really are designed to handle any type of overwintering situation. They have a very hard outer rind, and essentially what happens with these things when they form in the fall is they're nice round, about the size of a basketball, and then they start to dehydrate, because dehydration is how we tend to deal with cold, right? If you don't have water, that water won't freeze and won't then kill you. So they dehydrate over winter, and then when you start getting liquid precipitation in the late winter, early spring, they rehydrate up. And then they'll dehydrate down, and that goes back and forth, and very similar to wire fatigue, the equatorial or the part going around the Cleistothecia will essentially weaken, and then at some point when it's imbibing water or it gets full of water, it'll burst open and release its spores. So that's essentially how this thing functions and why it releases spores typically in the spring with rain, which is why we have this nice little key set that we use to describe when these things will actually release spores in the spring. And you guys have probably seen this both in Jay's recommendations and on the web. And so these things will release spores in the spring anytime you have liquid precipitation. But infection won't happen until you have green tissue out in the vineyard, because again, this particular pathogen only survives on green growing tissue. So infection doesn't happen until you have green tissue and until temperatures are warm enough, about 50 degrees Fahrenheit. The reason why there's that temperature requirement there is when things are much colder, the pathogen grows very, very slow. And oftentimes it'll grow so slow that it doesn't actually find a food source before it runs out of energy. So if you're trying to figure out when that first infection event happens in the vineyard, it's after bud break, which will be important for some of the things that Jay's going to talk about in terms of chemical control. It's after we have liquid precipitation, and up in Washington, we often say, and this probably applies to several of you guys down here as well, is anytime you have really heavy dew, so when there's condensation or water dripping off the vine, and when you have temperatures above 50 degrees Fahrenheit. So once that happens, once those things release their spores, that secondary, that really rapid production tends to happen in the spring, and that's what we have got highlighted here in blue. And the interesting thing is that as we talked about, that one single ascospore can grow to a reproductive colony or start that second cycle between 7 and 21 days. It's usually closer to 21 days in the early part of the growing season. And that one spore will form a colony. That one colony will produce 30 conidiaphores, and each of those conidiaphores will produce 1 conidia a day for about 30 days. So if you think about it, a single conidia can then, and so then once that's done, a single conidia or a single spore can result in a colony that produces almost 900 conidia. And each of those then go on to produce their own 900 conidia. So in about 2 generations, you have over 800,000 conidia potential in the vineyard. So you can kind of see how quickly that goes. And that's really something that we need to emphasize, is that with mildew management, it's all about prevention, because once something is kind of released from the floodgates, it goes. So once you have that rapid cycle, producing every 7 to 21 days in the summer, fall tends to come around. And the interesting thing with mildew, it has what we call mating types, an A and a B. You can liken it to male and female. And the only way you can get that overwintering Cleistothecia is if colony A meets colony B and they have a nice date. So essentially, that's all temperature related. And that's kind of what we're seeing here on the side, very similar to mildew in season. And sometimes we'll just not use that pointer. How about that? And so when we have cooler temperatures, those Cleistothecia take a really long time to develop. In many cases, they won't actually develop if temperatures are too cool. But when you have moderate temperatures, about 77 degrees, so which is what most of our falls tend to be like up in the Pacific Northwest, these Cleistothecia can essentially, colonies can grow into each other, mate, form Cleistothecia and reach maturation in what it takes about 300 growing degrees, or about a month. So it's quite rapid that these things develop, and essentially that mature overwintering form is what's going to take you into the next year. The interesting thing is when those Cleistothecia are formed in the fall will influence when they release spores, or when they start their spore release in the spring. So if they're formed early in the fall, those Cleistothecia tend to release their spores early in the spring. If they form late in the fall, they release their spores later in the season. And so interestingly, if you have an early frost event, that's actually can be quite helpful for you, because it's essentially killing all potential overwintering inoculum early, meaning the only things that are typically surviving the following spring will also release their spores early and potentially before bud break. Obviously, that you never get an absolute. You don't get all of your spores released before bud break starts, but that actually can help you. The converse to that is if you have a very long, extended fall and it's warm, you will get a lot of Cleistothecia forming, and a lot of Cleistothecia forming very, very late in the growing season. And those Cleistothecia will then release their spores very late in the following growing season, essentially providing many opportunities for additional inoculum production events to kind of kick off disease the following season. So that's something to kind of keep in mind. What happened last year will influence potentially what's going to happen this year in the growing season. So if you had an early frost last year, they might help you in disease management this year. If you had a late frost last year, it means we're probably going to have another difficult season coming up. And then kind of on that case in point, because I know a lot of you might be preparing to be doing something like this, and I'm sure Jay might be talking about this as well, is there's this concept of, oh, hey, if I can control all that mildew before the growing season even starts, I'm going to do that. I'm going to do a dormant lime sulfur spray. I'm going to do a dormant oil spray. I'm going to do a dormant micronized sulfur spray, do the dormant insert favorite product there. The challenge, though, is one, you'll never get perfect coverage, and I'm sure Andrew will talk about that next. And two, these Cleistothecia are extremely embedded in bark, making it even more difficult to get perfect coverage with that. And data has shown the only way that truly controlling or doing any of those dormant sprays or reducing inoculum overwintering, the only way that actually influences the final disease that you'll see at the growing season, the upcoming season, is if you do nothing at all, as if in a no-spray situation. And none of you guys are going to do a no-spray situation. And that's what we're seeing in this graph here. We have a low-pressure year into high-pressure year, so low pressure is top, high pressure is bottom. And along the x-axis here, you essentially have no Cleistothecia and a lot of Cleistothecia overwintering. And so you can see we have a couple different spray regimes in both graphs. The top line is when you don't spray at all. The middle line is when we spray only during the critical window, which we'll talk about in a couple slides. And the bottom line is when we do a full season spray. So even in a low pressure year, even if you just spray during the bloom period or not, there's not much actual statistical difference between having no Cleistothecia or very low Cleistothecia overwintering and a lot. So in other words, you could have done your dormant spray, but it's not really saving you much money at the end of the season. Even in an extremely high pressure year, you don't see that same difference. So it's really, in-season management is really what's giving you all of your control, rather than doing that kind of, I'd rather see you guys spend your money on a spray in season than that dormant application. Let's talk about weather. Weather is everything. We love weather. It's noted by the Weather Channel, 24 hours of nonstop weather. So powdery mildew, it's a Goldilocks type of a disease. It likes everything just right, and that is because it's entirely on the outside surface of the host, or 95% of its biomass is on the outside surface. It really likes that 77 degrees Fahrenheit, so it really is a moderate temperature performer. When things get really hot, it tends to knock back disease, and when things get really cold, it tends to knock back disease. It likes moderate humidity. When it starts getting below about 40% relative humidity, because this fungus is very exposed, it tends to dry out. And when you start getting to humidity levels that will essentially cause water condensation, free water will also hurt mildew once you're into the middle of the growing season. But otherwise, between about 40 and 99% relative humidity, this thing grows quite well. It also does not like direct sunlight exposure, and there's a couple of reasons for that. One, it's actual UVB, so UV damage on the fungus. And two, when you're in direct sun, if you think about leaf surface temperatures, if a leaf is sitting in direct sunlight, the surface temperature of that leaf is actually much hotter than what the air temperature is. So it's essentially a temperature response as well. So this fungus likes nice, moderate, cool, shady conditions. When we talk about the concept of powdery mildew not liking it too cold, this is just a quick depiction of that. So we have two colonies. This is what powdery mildew looks like when it's young. And if you grow powdery mildew in regular temperatures, the green means it's alive, it's well. But if you just do a quick exposure when it's relatively young to a cold shock, so essentially anything below about 36, 38 degrees Fahrenheit, it'll actually kill the middle of the colony. And what ends up happening is it resets that sporulation clock, so it then takes longer for it to sporulate again. So cold temperatures after bud break, even though we tend to freak out a little bit, going, oh, do I need to turn on the wind machine or not? That's actually one of the reasons why mildew is very, very slow out the gate. And for those of you living in slightly colder valleys, while frost risk is a major concern, that's probably helping you control mildew early season. Same thing happens on the other end of the spectrum. This is more for those that are farming on the east side of the state here. Those high temperature events can be really, really helpful for slowing mildew. And so once we start getting above about 90 degrees Fahrenheit, mildew does tend to slow down in growth. And when we get really high punctuated temperature events, it can actually damage colonies. It really rarely kills things outright, but it's more of a debilitation and sometimes just a delay in sporulation. And the reason why the research that does things in a lab will show that it can kill powdery mildew colonies, but in actuality, we rarely see that, simply because there's a lot going on in the canopy, and it's really hard to get that consistent temperature. But hot, dry conditions can be very, very helpful in controlling and slowing down mildew growth, particularly in July and August in this part of the country. The challenge, which is why canopy management is always extremely important, is what's going on outside is not necessarily what's going on inside. And we all know that. For those of you guys that farm on the east side, if you're out scouting in the middle of the day, the one way to break away from that 105-degree temperature is to just sit underneath the canopy. It's much nicer underneath there. And so what's happening on the outside of this canopy here, these outside leaves actually can get very, very hot, but the inside of that canopy, even if it's 105 outside, the inside of that canopy is probably hovering right around 80 degrees and a nice, probably ambient 80% relative humidity. So this is why things like leaf removal, shoot thinning, all these things with canopy management are absolutely critical with mildew management as well, and it's going to become more so as we start to run into some challenges with the chemistries that Jay's going to talk about in the next talk. The added benefit is these concepts of superheating and supercooling, things that we tend to get here in our environmental extremes. You guys have probably seen this, again, probably more so on the east side than here. Supercooling is essentially what happens is when the nighttime temperatures, in theory, are not going below freezing, but if it's a clear night, we get what we call radiational cooling, and the leaf surface will actually become colder than the air temperature, which is why you can often get frost damage on plants. There's some other reasons too, but you can get frost damage when temperatures are above 32 degrees Fahrenheit. We also have superheating, and sometimes you might see this in vineyards that are a little bit water stressed on hot sunny days. You'll notice the leaves droop, they turn away from the sun. In that case, when the vine cannot transpire, essentially what happens is those leaves get very, very hot, and you can also oftentimes get temperatures that are 10 to 20 degrees above ambient air temperature. So it's good for mildew control, and also one of the reasons why we sometimes don't see mildew on the outsides of canopies. Environment's another big component in terms of timing of spray programs and when things are going to go on. I pulled this from the St. Paul South Ag WeatherNet station for you guys down here, and from your 2017 season. I guesstimated that bud break was April 15th, so sorry if that was incorrect. But if you can kind of see here, what we're looking in this upper graph is how long it takes mildew to sporulate. So when I was looking through your guys' weather, if bud break was on April 15th, there was what we're calling an infection event on April 16th. Realistically, that probably wasn't, because your buds probably weren't big enough to really get a true infection event, but we'll just guess that it's there. And if you notice, early in the growing season, you have pretty long periods between generations. Essentially, your coverage is not quite as important in terms of having that longevity of that chemical there, because there's a long time between generations. But obviously, as we get into the growing season, those generations become quite tight every 8 to 10 days. But I'm guessing a lot of you were probably using chemicals that essentially said, oh, no, 21-day interval. That's why we use some of those products. Quintec, right? 21 days, fantastic. Did you have perfect coverage? How fast was the plant growing? Because if it's a 21-day product and you didn't have perfect coverage and this thing is producing every 7 to 8 days, well, you probably had a little bit of mildew building up in there. The other thing, which luckily you guys don't have as big of a problem here, but it can be in the Pacific Northwest, and if I were showing this graph for Washington, it'd be quite different, is winds. We have some challenges with gusts and wind gusts, especially in the early part of our growing season when it's super critical for disease management. And so you guys, on average, especially April and May, have only like 5 or lower single-digit numbers of days where the sustained winds are above 8 miles an hour, but we have a lot of days where they're gusty, and that is a challenge. In Washington, these numbers look like in the teens in the average wind speed, and essentially every day we have wind gusts that are going above 12 miles an hour. So it makes it very difficult for us to spray. We don't do night sprays either in the state, and this might be an issue down here as well, because I know you guys have some challenges with herbicide drift, is because if you spray at night, we have such huge inversions here, we can get some drift issues, and I know Andrew will probably talk about some of those in his talk as well. So all that influences both the biology and then how our programs are actually being executed. Let's talk about that grapevine plant. The challenge with the grapevine is it does a lot of things that makes mildew quite happy. One, it has indeterminate growth, and as we talked earlier about having summer laterals that push out any young active tissue, mildew loves. And so we always get that when we have continuously growing canopies. So that's kind of a challenge. Managing mildew on the canopy is often a very different beast than managing mildew on the fruit. And it's nice with us, the way most of us are training grapevines is in most cases, we have a nice uniform fruit zone, which does make targeting sprays, which I know Andrew will probably talk about, a little bit easier. But then, of course, in Washington, we have a lot of issues with suckers and latent buds that push given cold damage. And I think our latent bud pushing and excess bud pushing is probably akin to the amount of summer laterals you guys get on this side of the mountain range. The ultimate, I think, huge breakthrough in mildew management, probably in the last 15 years, is the concept of ontogenic resistance. So we know mildew only likes green-growing tissue, but we've also learned that mildew only likes young green-growing tissue, and that we can use that and fine-tune that for specific timing for mildew management. And so this is some work done out by Cornell, and the main take-home here is if you read through a lot of the past literature, it essentially tells you to start your spray programs at bud break and go all the way to about 8 bricks. Well, that's a lot of spraying. And especially in our climates, you probably don't need to spray that much because most of fruit is susceptible, essentially from starting at the growing season and really susceptible starting at rachis elongation through about 4 weeks after fruit set. And that's what you're seeing in this graph here. So what you're seeing here is timing of inoculation and then days after bloom. And you see most severe disease happens when the fruit or the developing clusters are exposed right at bloom until about 3 or 4 weeks afterwards. And then after that, they don't become infected. So that concept of ontogenic resistance essentially means we have this nice tight window that we can time our sprays to keep our fruit clean. The challenge there, though, is once a cluster is already infected, ontogenic resistance does not set in to its full extent, as if it had been healthy going into that development period. So you do have to keep that in mind. If you started to lose control early in bloom, ontogenic resistance will not save you as you go in to the ripening period. This is just kind of a highlight. Once clusters start to emerge and the rachis starts to elongate, that's when we really start to get worried. And if you think about the way flowers are designed, they are designed to capture pollen. Canidia look a lot like pollen in that case, so there's a lot of surface area for mildew spores to infect developing clusters, and that's probably why that's such a critical window. Once you start getting fruit that looks like this, if you've been able to keep it clean, Mother Nature will help you bat that one in pretty easily. And by the time you get to this stage, The only reason if you see new mildew growing on that, it's likely because you had infection going into that period. The challenge is what is synchronous versus asynchronous bloom. So on the East Coast, and especially in places like New York, they're very lucky. They always have sufficient chilling hours. So a single cluster can complete bloom between 24 and 48 hours, and a whole vineyard will complete bloom in about 3 to 4 days. As you guys know, that's not always the case out here. Sometimes when we have mild winters, a single cluster will take a week to complete bloom, and an entire vineyard can take up to 2 weeks to complete bloom. And if you're farming down in California, a single cluster can take a week and a half to complete bloom, and it might take up to 4 or 5 weeks for your entire vineyard to go through bloom. And so I've got this nice picture of a cluster I took down in South Australia. So on that same cluster, we have both parts of the cluster that are resistant to mildew and then some that are in that critical susceptible stage. So you do have to keep that in mind. How long is bloom in your vineyard? And you need to manage to essentially the most conservative, which would be when that first cap fall starts to go to when that very last cap fall is done. And sometimes that might be a little bit longer than our typical 6 to 8 week period. Ontogenic resistance also happens in leaves. Usually the very, very youngest leaf is not the most susceptible. It's about the 3rd or 4th leaf, the ones that are still kind of semi-transparent, a little bit glossy. And then once they get older, they are resistant to infection. And the interesting work, so this is work done by folks down in Tasmania, and they were kind of tracing source-sink relationships. And that third leaf, that most susceptible leaf, what's so cool about it is at that time, so really young leaves essentially are sinks, right? They're drawing from the plant to survive. Older leaves are sources. They're producing photoassimilates for the plant. That leaf that's the most susceptible is actually both at the same time. It's a transition period. So if you think about it from a mildew standpoint, there is a lot of food going on in that leaf. Hence why that tends to be the one that it tends to grow the most rapidly on. That's something that's pretty important. Extremely important because it relates to how we manage canopies. So unfortunately, every time you hedge that one shoot and you get 14 summer laterals pushing off, you now went from one section of susceptible tissue to 14 different sections of susceptible tissue, and that is a bit of a challenge. It's also why, when you can, using irrigation practices to control canopy growth is really important. So here on the left, you have a nice actively growing shoot tip. There's a lot of susceptible tissue and continuously developing susceptible tissue on that. As soon as you stop that shoot growth, say with regulated deficit irrigation or punctuated periods of drought, and you no longer have those newly developing leaf tissues, that shoot is no longer susceptible once those youngest leaves age beyond that susceptible period. So you can use canopy management in that regard to kind of control how rapidly mildew is developing in your vineyard. The other thing that I like to kind of point out is oftentimes when I'm called out to vineyards to inspect a potential mildew situation, I'm seeing a lot of leaves. They have mildew on them. They're like, well, Michelle, I don't believe this ontogenic resistance thing because, hey, look at this. All my older leaves have mildew all over them. You said that old leaves don't become infected with mildew. Well, what's going on? Well, by the time you see something like this in the top picture, which is a bunch of little mildew colonies about the size of a pencil eraser, that's about 4 weeks old. So those infections happened about 4 weeks ago. By the time you see something that's completely coated, that's probably a 6 or an 8-week-old infection. If you see clusters that are about BB size to pea size berries, those infections probably happened 4 or 5 weeks ago. So by the time you actually physically see mildew in the vineyard, you're looking at a management failure that happened multiple weeks beforehand. And that's why it's so hard to control mildew once you see something. It's really all about prevention, because by the time you see it, it's like a cockroach. There's a lot more than just one going on in the vineyard. But we're going to learn about some other techniques, and powdery mildew can be contained with technique. If me as a scientist, which means we usually have very few practical life skills, if I can control mildew to this level of a degree in a vineyard, so can you. That should be exciting. And so we can actually control with proper spray programs mildew really down to the vine. And if we can do that in our situation, there's obviously hope, much more hope for you guys, because again, we do a lot of things wrong in the scientific world. And so hopefully Jay and Andrew will talk about ways to do that in the next couple talks. All right.
While they're getting these set up, hi, I'm Jay Pscheidt. How many of you are growing on the west side? Raise your hand. I grow on the west side. Put those down. How many are growing on southern Oregon or east side? So there's a few. Okay, very good. Yeah, I need to get into it since they only give us 20 minutes to go here. So what am I going to do? Well, I'm sort of focusing on the future here in terms of what you can do for 2018. Michelle's just gone through powdery mildew biology, so I'm not going to cover that. I'm not going to really get into causes of control failure. There's a lot of talk about fungicide resistance. That's not necessarily the reason for your control failure. I am going to focus on how you make a plan, fungicide selection, and when you start and how to keep going. So first thing in your plan for 2018 is what happened in 2017. Did you have a lot of mildew or very little? If you had a lot of mildew, why, it's time to make a change and change your plan accordingly. If you didn't have any mildew and everything's just fine, then good job. Keep up the good work. I'm not sure you need a big change in your plan. Do everything Andrew says. Yeah, we need good coverage to get good disease control, and it's all those green growing tissues that Michelle just talked about. We'll get into fungicide selection in just a moment. I'm always amazed at how easy it is to grow grapes, unless you're late. And then I'm amazed at how horrible it is to grow grapes if you're late with your viticulture. So you must keep up on your particular training system and everything else that goes into it. Do look into, this is more important later in the growing season, but looking into sources that might be outside your vineyard, grapes that might be around the tasting room that don't get sprayed. That could be a source of powdery mildew, for example. And then scouting. Those high vigor areas, that's a lot of times where we see our powdery mildew getting started, and that's where you need to be looking once a week, especially around bloom time, so you can catch something if it's going wrong, and that's very important to do that. I had to turn these slides in earlier. I can't remember how long ago we had to turn these in, but since then, the 2018 Pest Management Guide has come out. It is available online, so even though this says a 2017 guide, this is something that will help you make some fungicide selections. There's a table there where I have all the effectiveness of the various fungicides to control the various grape disease, the two primary ones, bunch rot and powdery mildew. In the past, we've used color coding to kind of indicate the different groups, the different frac groups of fungicides. We've changed the color coding a little bit to focus more on what's resistant. Where have we been finding resistance out there? So the red indicates like the group 3 and group 11, frac group 3 and frac group 11 materials. We have been finding resistance in powdery mildew to those groups. The ones in yellow, we suspect there might be there. We don't have proof one way or the other, so sort of a caution on the yellow ones. Anyway, I'm not going to get into frac groups and what that basically a consortium of chemical companies got together, and rather than use the big words, so all these fungicides you're seeing here, these are demethylation inhibiting fungicides. It's when the chemists get into it, when the physiologists get into it, they call it the sterol biosynthesis inhibitors, and they're all big words. And so it's so much easier now just to say the group 3 fungicides. The key is if it has the same group number, they all have the same mode of action. For these, like the group 3s, they have a very specific mode of action. So these are all the fungicides that you can use to control grape powdery mildew that's legal in the Pacific Northwest. I have them by frac code number if you need to know the trade names. Some of those are in this green booklet that's for free in the back there. You can pick that up. There's lots of information online to get after these. A lot of different groups here in the first column. The second column is their resistance risk. You'll notice a lot of the funds toward the top there all have high to medium resistance risk. We'll talk about that last column. It looks too good to be true, right? But hang on here for a minute. So we have the group 1s, I'll come to those in just a moment. The group 3s and 11s are where we're seeing fungicide resistance. That's because they have a high resistance risk. We knew this was a possibility for over a decade now. You've done a very good job up to now, but now we have to worry more about resistance. I'm kind of worried about the group 7s. We won't talk about the 13 and the fact that I have it in my research plots. Hopefully none of you have resistance there. 19, M2, what's M2? So the first ones have a very specific mode of action. M2, well, that's just sulfur. It is a multi-site material where those earlier ones with group 3s and 11s, they hit a particular biochemical pathway on the fungus. Sulfur hits multiple pathways, and that's why it has, in the next column there, a low resistance risk. And it's a good to excellent material there. And then we have a couple of materials that they don't know exactly what the mode of action is, but they just know it's different than the other ones, and so that's U6 or unknown 6 or U8. They're all good to use, and of course you can always use these other ones toward the bottom there. There's several horticultural mineral oils, various soaps, microbial products, botanical extracts. In general, they tend to have a low resistance risk, but they have a much wider range of from slight to good in terms of their powdery mildew efficacy. Now, I'm going to go back up to the top there. Fret group number 1 was absolutely fantastic when it came out a few decades ago. It was so great. Everybody used it. Every crop you can think of on every disease, and within a couple of years they had resistance, and its resistance is extremely stable. And so the column that you see there on the extreme right side there is not quite right. We have to downrank things because of resistance, and so it really looks more like this. Yeah, group 1s are low efficacy, and the group 3s and 11s now have got much more wider variation. The group 7s there are in yellow and may not be as good as we think they are. We still have some excellent, good to excellent materials that you can use. Of course, if we're not using the other materials, we're going to put a lot more pressure on those others, and we could encourage resistance occurring there. Now, if you haven't had somebody come through and test your powdery mildews to see if they're resistant or not, how do you know if you've got resistance? Well, what have you done? Your history in your vineyard will be your best predictor of whether you have fungicide resistance. If you've used a lot of group 11 materials, a lot of strobilurine materials, you probably have resistance to that, and you probably should think heavily about switching it up and getting into different groups that you've been using. Notice I haven't been using trade names. I've been focused on the groups. There are multiple trade names within any particular group that we have. So anyway, what have you been doing? That's how you can figure out whether you've got resistance or not. So what should you be doing? Follow the rules. Rotate and tank mix fungicides of different modes of action. By different modes of action, we mean from different frat groups. And there are prepackaged mixes that may have multiple groups in them. The second one there, if you use too little of material, if you're using low rates, if you don't calibrate your sprayer well and you use too little material, you're going to encourage resistance development. This is why we want to have our rates up and good calibrated sprayers. The third one there, limiting your total number. Think of it this way. How many sprays do you usually use for powdery mildew? Can you use a particular frat group only once or twice during the growing season? Yeah, quite a challenge to do. E, education. You're here educating yourself. That's great. S, start with a multi-site. Basically, that's starting with sulfur is what we're talking about there. For resistance management, then rotating is fairly straightforward. Frat group A, for example, is just a general thing. You go out with that the first spray. The second spray, you're going out with frat group B, just something totally different. And then you can come back to A and then alternate through the season that way. Or you can tank mix them together. You can take both of those materials, put them in the tank at the same time, spray that out. That's one way to do it. Or go buy a prepackaged mix that already has A and B in it, so you're just putting in one product, but it has two modes of action in there. Unfortunately, that's not legal to do, to use that for each and every spray. If you look at the label, it says you can only use it twice before you have to switch out of whatever group is in that mix. And so legally down at the bottom there, you can use the AB, for example, here twice before you have to switch to C, something just totally, completely different. Now, grapes actually represent probably the hardest thing to work with here. So here, this might be like if you think of a timeline here where you're starting out with AB and just going through the season, going after your powdery mildew here. the trouble is we've got other things we got to worry about. Let's get into the real world here. We've also got to worry about this other thing, bunch rot, right? Botrytis bunch rot. We can't ignore that in our program. We might have to use fungicides for this. And you know, a lot of the fungicides will hit both of these groups, at least they claim to be able to hit both groups of pathogens here. And you might be using this AB material, for example, here. What do I got here? We got 1, 2, 3, 4. Well, that fifth one could go, that could be the exact same spray. By the time you get way out there going to try to control botrytis with material B, you may have already encouraged a lot of resistance development. So what you're doing for powdery mildew can influence what's going on for bunch rot, and vice versa. What you do for bunch rot can influence what's going on for powdery mildew. So make sure you include that in your plan. Don't do calendar spraying. You're going to have a lot of trouble if you start your program based on the Gregorian calendar. Yeah, okay, a data slide. Down at the bottom, I've been here for 30 years now. I went back and looked at some of the data that we had there, and we're ruthless going out and looking for when powdery mildew first starts in our plots down there in Corvallis. And that's the red dots that you see there. And if you've sort of noticed that, so on the bottom line, the x-axis, the horizontal line, that's the years. And so we go back to 1993 there and up to 2017. On the y-axis, the one going vertical on the left side there, is the date. Okay, so if you're one of those calendar sprayers and you say, well, I start my powdery mildew program on what? Memorial Day, right? Or maybe it's, you know better than that, it's May 15th, right? That's when you start your program. You'll notice, if you start looking at about between 20th of May and 10th of May, you'd have done very well over the last several decades, right up until about 2015 and 2016, when powdery mildew actually got started before that. So yeah, we don't want to do that. There's one other thing to look at on here, and we've got the green dots which indicate Pinot Noir bloom, and you'll notice in each and every case, powdery mildew starts well before bloom. Sometimes it's right about just before bloom. That was in 1 year there, or a couple of years. But you always have to start your powdery mildew program well before bloom. How do you start? Well, what do they do in Europe? You know the old-fashioned thing. You plant roses at the end of the row, and you hear the old-fashioned. The Italian grower was telling me at this particular vineyard that the powdery mildew starts on the roses, and then I know when to go and spray my grapes for powdery mildew. Understand, rose powdery mildew is not the same as grape powdery mildew. They won't go to each other, but don't do it this way. There's absolutely there's no research on it at all. And if you go out and buy roses, you're likely to get a resistant rose, and then you would never see any powdery mildew on your rose, and you wouldn't be spraying your grapes, and that would not be a good idea. We're trying to look into this a little bit. I've taken data on lots of different powdery mildews. The best that I could come up with was actually cherry powdery mildew. You'll sort of notice 2009, 10, and 11, cherry powdery mildew either occurred before grape powdery mildew or about the same time. Unfortunately, in 2012 and 2015, cherry powdery mildew occurred after grape powdery mildew. So, yeah, don't use that as a marker. And I didn't really think anybody was going to plant cherries at the end of their vineyard rows anyway, so never mind. So, how do we start? Remember that disease triangle Michelle just showed you? The host, pathogen, environment. Well, the first thing you can do, the one at the top there, host, we can just go with whatever inch growth you want to go with in terms of starting your program. That works. 3 inches growth, she mentioned, 6 inches growth, 10 inches growth. It's an effective start for your program just before, well before bloom. In the bottom corner there, you can monitor for powdery mildew spores. Walt Mahaffey's had that program for a while. You can commercially contract for that. I think that's still something that you can do in 2018. And so when you find powdery mildew spores flying around out there with those little rotorods, you can start your powdery mildew program. Or finally, you can monitor the weather, and there's several different programs out there to try to help you both start your program and time each of the various applications. Probably the most popular one out there is the University of California Davis program, or sometimes called the Gubler-Thomas program, simply measuring temperature to start in most of the season. There's a New York program that Michelle was kind of getting close to there on the numbers that she was giving you. There's one out of Germany. We've actually tested all three of these, and they work quite well in the Willamette Valley for starting and controlling powdery mildew. I have not tried the one out of Canada or the one out of Italy, but I suspect quite strongly that most all of these are conservative programs, and you would probably do fine with those. And you can contract with the people that service your weather equipment or get you your weather equipment. There's a few on the trade show here to monitor and run some of these programs. This is just the Gubler-Thomas model, and just very typical information, or typical type of thing that we would get for the Willamette Valley. I've seen this kind of pattern most every year. So the risk index is the vertical, the y-axis there is the risk index. Once you get up to 60 and above, that's considered high risk or high powdery mildew pressure. The dates along the x-axis along the bottom there. And as the season goes on, at some point our powdery mildew risk just jumps up above 60 and kind of stays there all summer long until we get close to bloom and things start getting a little cooler, and then it becomes down below 60. And so we're always on short intervals for going after powdery mildew. Very rarely in the Willamette Valley do we see a break. Now in California, and I suspect in southern Oregon and probably on the east side, you'll find something, and this happened only once here in the Willamette Valley, 2014, where we had the same sort of thing occurring where we jumped up above 60, kind of stayed there for a while. But then we had a big period in the middle there. Oh, what was that? July, ended mid-July to early August, where it drops below 60 for an extended period. During that time, you can extend your intervals out, probably save some fungicide, but you got to monitor it very carefully because, boom, it's right back up to above 60 again without any trouble. Only once in the Willamette Valley have I seen this. This is more typical of what you'd find in our more arid growing regions where you can monitor the weather a little bit carefully. The time you want to be real careful, you want to be on tight intervals, is during bloom. That's when things are most susceptible. So what stage of bloom is this? I'm not sure what you would call that. On the one side, yeah, it hasn't started to bloom yet. On the other side, it has. This is, I might call, basically it's always a population. You go out and check 100 flowers. What's the average out there? This might be like about 50% bloom, might be what we might say for this particular, just looking at these two particular clusters. The key here is knowing that calyptra, those fused sepals, that hood, that cap, whatever you want to call it, when that pops off, exposes the ovary, super susceptible to powdery mildew for the next couple of weeks. You want to be on top of that in particular. Again, and this is another one that I have never shown this particular one, this data set. I went back my 30 years of fungicide testing. When we do fungicide testing, we start before bloom, and then it's every couple of weeks. We go out every 2 weeks, we're going out with another spray of the fungicide. Well, I asked myself, well, if I go back to each one of these trials and I put down, when did that spray occur during bloom? Did it occur at 10% bloom, 60% bloom? So what you're seeing here along the bottom is the BBC growth stage. So 61 is 10% bloom, 65 would be 50% bloom, 69 would be 90% bloom, 70 would be, well, we're getting past bloom. You'll notice there's a lot of data points on that 10% bloom area there. And we're looking at, in this case, this is incidence of powdery mildew on the clusters. You can also look at it for severity of powdery mildew on the clusters. A little bit better. That's not just one point there, it's at the 61. There's a lot of data points sitting right in there. But you'll notice that as we get further into bloom, the data becomes a lot more variable. And so I've changed my recommendations a little bit. I'm actually going to make rather than changing or adjusting your spray program, which we've been talking about for years, you get into 10% bloom, start spraying again. I don't care if you've been 4 days from your last spray or 5 days from your last spray or 2 weeks, 10% bloom, get started again. That's what the data is telling us. We know we're very susceptible at bloom. And it just seems that if we get into that early bloom stage with our fungicides, we'll get a lot better control on the clusters overall. So, the plan for 2018, review what happened in 2017, do everything Andrew says. He's about ready to talk about that. Make your fungicide selection based on what you've already used in the past. Switch it up. Keep powdery mildew guessing as to what you're going to come at it with next. Yeah, timely management. You really need to get in there and get that done. It's critical for getting good coverage and control of powdery mildew. And scouting, especially in those hot spots that you know where it tends to start up. Short intervals during bloom, very important. None of that 21-day stuff. It just, I don't believe in 21 days in the Willamette Valley. Not any fungicide. It just won't work with the materials that we have. Maximum 2 weeks. Sulfur, you're looking at about 7 days to really get after it. Adjust your interval to hit 10% bloom. That's a new recommendation, a more specific one, and I hope that will help people get better control. And if you're using sulfur or alternative products, you may need to do multiple applications during the bloom. We'll stop there, let Andrew talk, and get after it later.
Right, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. So I've come across from the East Coast, from New York State, to talk to you today about methods of improving spray deposition in grapevines, in particular with powdery mildew. And I want to cover three main areas with you. The science, so the engineering science, so I'm an engineer, so we're looking at the spraying machine, discuss the engineering science behind what I'm going to tell you, to show you the technology, the machine and modifications of the machine, and then to bring in the common sense factor. So you'll remember that common sense is a thing that people used to have until the internet was invented, and now it's gone by the by. So as a way of introduction, my role at Cornell was to look at spray application, the pesticide application technology, via engineering methods. So what can we do to improve deposition and reduce drift? And so the work I'm going to show you in the next 30 minutes is really based on the work of my students and my postdocs and fellow researchers at Cornell. The challenge is exactly the same, be you in New York State, Oregon, Washington, or in Tasmania. We need to get that spray onto the canopy, onto whatever the target is, be it the leaves or the grapes. So we need to improve deposition. If we're applying at, say, 60 gallons per acre, those 60 gallons must hit that canopy. It's no good dumping some of it on the ground, some of it in the air, letting it drift from here to go up to Washington or down to California. They have their own chemicals. They can put their own stuff on. There's no lot of point you doing it on their behalf. So we need to reduce drift. And by definition, if we reduce drift, we therefore improve deposition. Because if it hasn't blown across the county line, it's going to go into the canopy next to the sprayer. And remember, that is the target, the row next to the sprayer. We'll come back to this all the time. So we also want to improve the deposition, and this results in minimizing the powdery mildew, or eradicating it if you're lucky, but minimizing. I'm generous in my words, so we'll minimize it. But notice the bottom left-hand photograph, often forgotten. Reduce contamination to the tractor and the sprayer, because some poor soul has to maintain that machine. So forever practical, I'm thinking now of the operators. If the sprayer is contaminated, then the operator might not be feeling too rosy the next few days. So we want to make sure that's okay. So that's the safety plug. And then finally on the right, quality wine is our target. Remember, we must produce good wine in Oregon. And so I'm going to cover three main thrusts: the liquid flow, the airflow, and the forward speed. Notice airflow has three components which we must consider: direction of the air, speed of the air, and the volume of air that's being produced. Remember, the traditionalists in the room will use an old traditional air blast sprayer designed in the 1960s for apple trees that are at 24-foot spacing with huge canopies growing 20 feet in the air. You're growing vines that are normally well manicured at much narrower row setting and at a much lower height. It stands to reason if your vine canopy needs 4,000 cubic yards of air per hour, what are you doing spraying it with an air blast sprayer that's producing 50 to 60,000 cubic yards? It's madness. So the common sense, you see, has disappeared. So let's now look at how we apply all of this to maximize penetration, improve deposition onto the leaves and the grapes. In all the trials I'm going to show you now, you'll see that the tracer we use, so we can spray pyranine or tartrazine as our tracer. Tartrazine we prefer because it's a food-safe dye. We then analyze the rinsate that we obtain from rinsing the leaves and or the bunches of grapes. And we then assess leaf area, and we get our results then, as you can clearly read, so much dye per square centimetre of leaf or per pipe cleaner if we're looking at drift. But today we're not looking at drift, we're purely looking at deposition. So let's start then at the beginning with liquid flow. The science is that when you halve the diameter of a droplet, you increase the number of droplets by the power of 8. So if we start off with an extremely large droplet, 500 microns, this 100 microns is about the thickness of the average human hair, okay? So 5 times the thickness of your hair. This is a big droplet. You'll see whether this droplet sticks to the leaves in a moment. If we halve it to 250, so we select a nozzle that produces 250 micron droplets, which is about the typical hollow cone spray droplet when the nozzle is new, then for the same value, we'll get 8 times the number of droplets. That will give us better coverage. Obviously, if you're hitting a leaf or a bunch of grapes with 8 times the number of droplets, you're going to get better coverage. Why would I stress this? Because if you're one of these characters that, wow, we've never changed the nozzles since the dealer delivered the sprayer, and you discover the dealer came when Granddad was a boy, you know. He had it for his 21st birthday, and the old boy's been in a box for 30 years. So, you know, it's time to change the nozzles. The other thing which operators do, we're all guilty of it, predominantly because sprayer drivers are men. It tends to be a male thing, which I know isn't very correct these days. I apologize, Michelle, for this comment. But men tend to say, oh, you're applying lime sulfur. Yeah, the nozzle's blocked. Oh, bugger. I shall just get a piece of wire and roger out this nozzle. You know, try and unblock it. You've increased the size of the hole. You therefore produce, go back. You therefore produce a large droplet. Again, you've only now got one missile, one droplet, whereas before you had 8. And if we carry on through with the science, halving the 250 down to 125 microns, we now get 8 times 8, 64. That again is quite acceptable, give us very good coverage, but now remember, it is a fine spray, and so it could be prone to drift if you are spraying on a windy day. And as we saw, there are so many windy days and gusts of wind that you may find yourself in problems with a very fine. So don't go for a nozzle that produces coarse droplets, or don't make a nozzle that will produce coarse droplets by A, never changing it. So calibration will tell you the flow rate. Therefore, you should be okay. Don't go for a nozzle that creates too fine a mist because a lot of it will blow away. Okay, that's the background. Let me show you. So here we have a simple series of slides which will show you a droplet generator. This is a device that creates one droplet in a laboratory. One droplet on its own, we can adjust the droplet size. It will drop a distance onto a leaf. In this case, we'll use a pea leaf, and we will film what happens. Now, we haven't got time to watch the film. Tomorrow's workshop at Pscheidt, they have time to watch the film, so we'll see it tomorrow if you're coming to that. But the point to note, when we had a big droplet, around about 650 microns, can you see? So about 6.5 times human hair. That droplet, when it hit the leaf, bounced 8 times. The droplet is like a cannonball. It hits the leaf and bounces up and down and ultimately will fall off or roll off and may well land on the leaf below. If luck's on your side, if luck's not on your side, which it usually isn't, then it's going to fall to the ground. And what a waste of product that is. What can we do? If we select the right nozzle in the first place, now you see we've got a slightly smaller nozzle, 375 microns is the droplet size. Now it's only bounced 4 times. And so on and so on, if we keep reducing it down. So the take-home message here, fine droplets are drift-prone, medium droplets will stick to the leaves and bounce a lot less than cannonballs, which are the large droplets created by poking bits of wire inside nozzles and never changing the nozzles in calibration. Let's look at it from a coverage point of view. The larger the diameter of the nozzle, therefore the more flow rate occurs, and frequently the larger the droplet that's being produced to get that volume of liquid through that little hole in the nozzle. You can see yourselves the larger application rate, 75 gallons per acre, produces those droplets on the leaf. And on the left-hand side, at 35 gallons per acre, we have the finer droplets, because we have a smaller hole in the nozzle, therefore potentially smaller droplets, and they're sticking to the leaf. This is important because as we now look at what happens in traditional spraying systems, where you go up between 2 rows of vines, row on the left, row on the right, you're spraying into the canopy. You get to the headland the other end, you turn, let's say we turn right, we go maybe missing 2 rows and then come back down, and then 5 minutes after we'd sprayed our row previously, we're coming up on the other side of the canopy. What are we going to do? The traditionalist comes along with an air blast sprayer, an almighty air blast, a great puff of wind, 120, 150, an AgTech 190 mile an hour airspeed, and blows those leaves. Which leaf do you think is going to hold the most spray once you've gone past with a big air blast? The one on the right. You're going to shake the living daylights out of it. It's going to flutter, and all those big droplets will coalesce. They run together, and they drip straight off the leaves. And you say, bugger, we've now wasted a lot of spray, okay? So it's important to note that medium, fine stroke medium droplets will stick, okay? They stick to the leaves. You have seen this. The gentleman in the room noticed this in the shower every morning. You've seen the small water droplets in the shower sticking to the hairs on your arms and your legs and your beards for the younger people, okay? So you've seen this. It's all a distant memory to me, of course. I have much hair left. If you move, many grape growers I know still haven't decided what trellis system is the best to use. And so different trellises need different volumes of spray. Different varieties might need different amounts. Because the coverage, and it's your decision what you believe to be excellent coverage, of course, is dependent on many, many factors. If you're going from from canopy A to canopy B to variety C to variety D, so on and so forth, you need to change application rate, perhaps. These modern things in technology, flow controllers, I commend to you, $4,500, $5,000 when they're fitted, and you see there are lots of companies make them in the marketplace, and they allow you in the cab to adjust application volume or application rate on the move as you go along, and to maintain a constant application rate. As you're going up a hill, these beautiful hills around here, as you're going up, you start to slow down. Speed is one of the 3 factors that affect application rate, you remember. Forward speed, pressure, and nozzle hole size. So if speed is varying, then as you're coming down the hill, you have 300 gallons of spray in the tank behind you, pushing you along. You're no longer going at 3 miles an hour, you're going at 3.5, 4 miles an hour, and that then will affect one of the 3 factors. These rate controllers then take care of that by adjusting the pressure in the system, okay? So I commend those to you if you have lots of different trellis systems, lots of different varieties, as a number of people have. Next to calibration, this is the bugbear of anyone who teaches this subject, calibration, how exciting can it get? And here you can clearly see, no matter what size sprayer you have, you need to calibrate it. Pre-season check, in the next few weeks, start doing it. We haven't time today to dwell on this subject, so I commend you to the well-known internet thing called YouTube. The young ones in the room know about YouTube. And you can type in calibrating Vineyard sprayers, air blast sprayers, and you'll see we have a number of videos you can watch, okay? It's great if you have insomnia, you know, you just start watching this stuff and you're gone like a baby, you know. When you're fed up with it, I suggest you tap in German hammer juggler. And this will restore your faith in young people. Those of you who are becoming old cynics like me. But it's true. No, it's not true, I'm an old cynic. It's true that young people are fantastic. And you'll see German hammer juggler on YouTube. Okay? But calibration first. What's new and exciting to help us in calibration? 2 things to show you. First, you know, in the modern scheme of life, using an app on an iPhone for 2 things. The first thing, it tells you what nozzles to use. Most of the major nozzle manufacturers they all have nozzle selection charts, which used to be on paper. Now, in the comfort of your farmyard, you can stand there in a Tyvek suit, big pair of rubber gloves, trying to operate your iPhone, looking at the app, telling you what nozzles you should use and what the flow rate should be. Absolutely fascinating. I fear where people are going to go and where the phone is going to go. Is it going to drop in the tank at the top and there's another $600 gone? Anyway, the other thing to do to speed up calibration, electronic tip testers, these small flow vessels which you can buy, they speed up calibration to, say, for a Vineyard sprayer, 10 minutes. Calibrate the whole sprayer in 10 minutes. If you're taking more than 10 minutes, you need to buy one of these. You fit the hoses to all the nozzles, then you get the end of the hose, the machine is working. There's no spray. Remember, rule 1 in calibration, don't get wet. Okay? So all the nozzles are firmly attached. We'll see this tomorrow, and then you use this type of thing, we'll show you tomorrow. You put the hose in the vessel. As the liquid flows up the vessel, those of you on this side of the room will see there's a probe here at the base and a probe there at the top. As the liquid level goes up, it conducts the small electricity coming from the probe. Once it hits the other one, the circuit is complete, and it gives you a large digital display of the flow rate. Phenomenal. $150 out of Gempler's catalog, Gempler's online catalog, made by InnoQuest, and the one in the middle is made by Wilger. And if you think $150 is high, well, the one in the middle is $450. You pay your money, and you take the choice. Okay. So now to the crust of the whatever the word is, it's gone now. But the meat of the subject is airflow. After 40 years of wandering around sprayers, airflow is the problem, in my opinion, as you'll see. 3 aspects of air for us to look at. Let's see. The purpose of the air, then, is to take the droplets from the sprayer to the target, the leaves, the grapes, either side of the sprayer, not 2 rows away, 3 rows away, each side. Protect the droplets against the wind on a windy day. On some sprayers, Guillemot, Chima, AgTech, is to create the droplets, called air shear nozzles. So we need high-speed air in that case. And to give a degree of shaking, a wee bit of rustling to allow the spray to penetrate the canopy. That's becoming less of an issue as we go more into leaf pulling and leaf plucking, but it's still important. The sad part is, of course, the old 1960s sprayers produce too much air. That volume of air, 50, 60,000 cubic yards of air per hour, is far in excess of what a traditional, well-manicured vineyard canopy needs, which, as I say, could be 4,000 cubic yards. So 4,000 might be what we want, and we've got 50 to 60. So we need to do something about it. And as I've already alluded to, as we go back a second time on the other side of the canopy with a single row sprayer of any sort, we give it another blast of air, another shaking of the old leaves, and those big droplets just roll right off, okay? So we need droplets of the right size. We now need air of the right size. How can we do it? If you have the basic of sprayers, nothing at the top, the first thing to consider then is air direction. We need some way of directing the air. And so these small deflectors at the top, you should adjust them if you have an old-fashioned air blast, and at the bottom. And as you can clearly see on that bottom right-hand diagram, the work done by Balsari at the University of Turin, you can see you're getting 100% of the useful air taking the droplets to the canopy, whereas in the upper one, you're not. And so we can attempt, and it is a pretty weak attempt on an air blast, to try and get it to work better. We'll see tomorrow at the workshop where actually if we adjust what's called nozzle orientation, where we move the nozzle body in relation to the manifold, we can, in fact, do this a lot better. But for the purpose of air at the moment, we're looking at that. This is the science behind it. We've spent many hours in aircraft hangars in New York looking at airflow patterns, and you can see the top right-hand photograph shows you where we're using soap bubbles made of outer casing is soap, the inside gas is helium, so those bubbles will float. They have a neutral buoyancy. They just sit where you put them. They'll stay. We have a machine that puts the bubble here, and it will stay there for 20 minutes. You drive it into or you put it near the intake fan of the sprayer. It will go through the fan, won't get chopped up. It goes round the fan blades, even though they're going at such speed, and then will come out. And the top right-hand photograph shows you that. We then plot that information on a graph. As you can clearly see, the top left and the bottom right graphs are clearly showing you how, when we use a tower sprayer, the preferred method, we can straighten out that air and direct it. Instead of letting it go up to the gods, the tower. So if you have the sprayer on the top left-hand photograph, no need to sell it, just buy a grape tower to fit it. About $3,000 to $4,000. For, if you're around Wayland or Mr. Rears down the road, they'll gladly sell you one. You may have decided, no, we're going to go with modern sprayers. The Europeans have been growing grapes for centuries. They don't know about sprayers. So here's an example. I give you this. It is only an example. This is the Guillemot, as it's called on the West Coast. So it's an Italian Cima. And you can clearly see by having trials, this sprayer here is available just with the lower fingers. So the base part of the sprayer is the basic model. And then as an optional extra, you can have the tower with the upper fingers. And so now you've got air going upwards, coming out of these fingers and air coming down from the upper fingers. You therefore are getting turbulence occurring in the canopy, and therefore wherever turbulence occurs, that's how the droplets fall out of the airstream. In this case, you can clearly see by having both units, upper and lower, you therefore get throughout the canopy, the top of the canopy, 53, center 34, bottom 46. If you compare that to being a cheap person, to use your language, cheap person, then you have lower units only, you get very little at the top of the canopy. As we've seen, that's where this disease loves growing on young tender leaves and all this stuff. So we need to get it all through the canopy. So the tower of whatever sprayer you have is a much better than just the basic version, as you see. Here's another example. This is on an old King Kelder. These things were made when the Ark landed. These old sprayers, a fishtail sprayer like this. You see them, King Kelder, AgTech, companies like this. And here you see with a modification, we've got much better deposition throughout the whole canopy. Okay, you can see that clearly. And again, on and on, I should put too many of these in. You can clearly again see the effect of the deflector or the tower in the dark blue slides. Throughout the canopy, it's a much more even distribution. So I commend towers to you of whatever type it is, some form of elongated outlet. And we have lots of makes now who do that. This work showing you the tower system and powdery mildew reduction. This is here on Concord grapes in the juice industry of New York. And you can see it's this table here I want to show you, the lower table. And where we had the new head, that's what we call the tower system, we got that amount of 26.6% infection on the leaf. Where we had the old design, the fishtail, we got 32% leaf infection. So there's a significant difference between the head, the old head and the new head. So I commend towers to you. How can you do this? You can look at air direction by simply using a mast mounted in the canopy, attaching water-sensitive cards, or if you don't have enough money, the cards are very expensive. They're now $60-odd for 50 cards from Syngenta. You buy those from Gempler's. But there is a new company on the block, InnoQuest, who sell them for $30 a packet of 50. So they're still very expensive. In New York, our growers don't have that sort of money. They're more into saving up for the F-350 King Ranch truck. So they don't want to waste their money. And so they go to Staples or Office World and they buy cash register tape. So those of you who come tomorrow will see this. You get a long pole, a 2-inch by 1-inch, a wooden pole, and you staple to it cash register tape. And then you go and get some food coloring or some dye, and you have a drive-by with your sprayer, squirting something safe, some colored liquid, against the till roll, cash register roll, and you see where the spray is going. This saying, oh, we just eyeball it. Well, if you can see droplets less than 50 microns, which is quite a lot in a spray, then you're a better man than anyone else in the world. So you've developed a new law in science. So this is Nobel Prize stuff. So you can't do that. So you've got to have some indicator, and cash register tape works exceptionally well, and it's very, very inexpensive. Okay? Adjusting air direction, good sprayers in the marketplace will allow you to do that. Here are some examples, okay, where we can adjust the airflow because it's turbulence we want within the canopy. Okay? The traditional air blast sprayer is a one-pass hit. Up it goes. If the canopy doesn't take it, the saying is, what goes up in the air, the good Lord takes what he wants, and what he doesn't lands back in the river. Well, that is not the way to behave. We need to direct that air and keep the center of activity. You see there I am in the middle with a stick with flagging tape, and we can get that flagging tape to spin on the, you'll see this tomorrow, those of you who are coming tomorrow. And of course, the ultimate would be to have a tunnel, and then you just avoid all the airflow, you get precision spraying, etc. But that's for another day. Adjusting air volume, now volume and speed. What can we do? For years, we've had the old Cornell donut. This is a system where you take a piece of plywood and you strangle the air intake. So we're not getting 50 to 60,000 cubic yards of air. We're now only getting a third of that. Early season spraying, we want a wee bit of air. Mid canopy, a little more, and full canopy, depending on trellis and variety, a bit more puff, but not too much puff. These sort of things allow it. And as you know, your grandparents, when they got off the boat, they had these adjustable airflow dampers on a fireplace, on a stove. You adjust the thing, you increase, decrease the amount of air for the fire. Exactly the same. If you have an old air blast sprayer, I commend it to you. If you have a modern sprayer, whatever you do, don't do this. Because nowadays modern sprayers use cheap steel fan blades, which will bend like they snap like a carrot and send the fan out of balance. Very dangerous. But if you've got a 1960s air blast built like I hate to say it, built like the Titanic, pretty strong. It's got British engineering at its best, and and you can see the effect. Here's the science. Then we measure the airflow. You can see the effect of a donut, where it's reducing the volume of air to try and match where the canopy is. Okay, if you have an old-fashioned sprayer. For modern sprayers, we've developed and patented a louver system at Cornell. Early season, we want minimum airflow, so we can redirect the air. Intermediate, so medium canopy, we want a wee bit of air going now to the canopy, not so much being redirected. And in full canopy, we need more push to get the stuff in. And you can see it working on this with this Ocella. This is an Italian sprayer that we've used in trials, and you can see we get much better deposition when the louver is adjusted on either side of the sprayer. And you can see why you don't want a lot of air with a typical canopy, as you see in the slides. This is the result of many trials, and you can see in this particular one, this is Vineyard, which is quite a sprawling canopy, and you can see we need, in early season, if we adjust the airflow, we reduce drift, therefore we've improved deposition considerably, 82% increase in deposition, which is really good. But the point to note in late season, if we shut the air down too much, we then lose penetration, and therefore we need a wee bit of air always just to help penetrate the canopy to get it into those clusters. Then airspeed, we must adjust airspeed. Old-fashioned sprayers are not very good at this. Traditionally, you put a high and low gearbox on it. Not a lot of use, a fat lot of use, you could say. 20% reduction in airspeed, it's hardly worth doing. So my cri de coeur to manufacturers of sprayers is to give us a better gearbox. And you can clearly see here how deposition will increase by changing PTO speed. Shut down the PTO. Why run it at 540? Shut down engine revs. Those who drive sprayers will know. Shut down the engine speed. The PTO, in this case, going at 300 RPM. And you can see how the deposition on the left and right-hand side of the canopy will increase. Because we're not blowing it through. The fan isn't going as fast. Speed is therefore reduced at the fan, and so we get better deposition. Good sprayers will allow you to do this. The modern sprayers. I'll give you two. Here's a farmer's own on the left, DIY, fitted his own hydraulic motor from off a harvester. Lots of hydraulic motors on old harvesters. And then on the right, the modern Croplands head out of South Australia, which is imported here into Washington State by Vinetech. And you can see, and Blue Line, mustn't forget Blue Line always. And you can see the controller in the cab is really a dimmer switch. So the hydraulics that drive these little fans on the right allow us to control the oil flow. And this little valve is what's called electric over hydraulic valve. Hydraulics control the oil flow. It's like a water wheel. And so the electric valve closes or opens, and it operates like a dimmer switch. My students always tell me about dimmer switches. They use it for mood lighting on a Saturday in the room. You have modern houses, they turn the lights down low a wee bit. It sets the mood, apparently. I always thought 4 pints of beer always set the mood to my head. Fall asleep. Can't be doing with this stuff. Anyway, and that has led us to have very, very good precision spraying when we're using sensors to measure canopy size. But we're not here to discuss the precision bit. I'll show you this. This is why airspeed is so important. We're using helium bubbles, so soap bubbles full of helium gas. There's no wind speed here. We're looking at the bunch of grapes from underneath. We're looking up at the bunch of grapes. Notice now, as the wind speed starts to increase, the bubbles are coming from the left-hand side of the photo, and they're coming back to the back side of the bunch of grapes. As the wind speed starts to go up, the point of divergence on the left is further away from the left-hand side of the grapes, and the point of convergence on the right is further away. And as we keep increasing now, there's hardly any droplets coming back to the right-hand side. So the back side of our bunches of grapes is not getting sprayed. Can you see that? That's it. And we've done, 5 minutes, yes, right, thank you. So we've done that. This will not surprise you, especially last night. If you were still wandering the streets at 11 o'clock, you would have spotted this around every lamppost that you sort of struggled past. And this is the classic horseshoe vortex in the snow. You see it every day around trees, telegraph poles. Where the air goes, the boundary layer is set up. Professor Prandtl wrote in 1905, he's the Austrian physicist who was a fluid dynamicist, wrote about boundary layers. So it's been known. For you to remember this, the slower the airspeed, the better. Look at the car. Sell the Vineyard, buy an Audi R8 Spider for $260,000. This car, you're driving along down Route 1. Say you're going all the way down, you're going to end up in Monterey or somewhere exciting, California. Going down the coastal road. There you are, left-hand photo. It's a nice dry day. Starts raining. You don't want to stop. You want to stay dry. What are you going to do? You're going to gun the car up to its maximum speed, or are you going to slow down? What do you think you would do? Someone even? Go faster. Why would you go faster? What happens? You've seen it in the car. The air goes up over the hood, over the windshield, the boundary layer of the car. Make sure that you in the seat, you don't get wet. Isn't that great? Yeah, you try. Buy one of these. Rent one for the day. Tell you, stunning car. And so Prandtl was right in 1905. 2018, we're now applying it to grapes. So you see, shut down the air speed, please, and you'll be okay. We need a wee bit of air speed to get penetration, of course. So some work was done by a grad student of my colleague Wayne Wilcox. We did some work with sprayers. The number of leaf layers then act as good turbulence, so the droplets come out of the air plume. But as we do more and more leaf pulling, we get bigger problems. And as you can clearly see, the leaf layers in the top chart here, you can clearly see if there's only 0.5 of a leaf layer or one leaf layer, we get far more depositions in the top chart. You see deposition on the vertical axis on the Y, and as we have more leaf layers, we get much less. And so if we're shutting down the air, we need enough air, though, to get penetration. If we're pulling leaves off, exposing the bunches, sunlight into wine, all that stuff, then we're going to have the boundary layer effect. So it's a toss-up between the two. Right, 1 minute. Okay. So pressing on, and this is what we see, okay, where we've got the back of the grapes not getting sprayed. Can you clearly see that? This is with the fluorescent tracer. The cane is covered in droplets. See the little yellow droplet, greeny droplets? The rachis is covered in droplets, but not the back of the bunch. You must wonder why. Okay, so that's it. So to conclude, seeing is believing. How are you going to check your deposition and or coverage? Then water-sensitive cards. Okay. There's another product called Surround, which is a white kaolin clay. One of the chemical companies, Engelhardt or whoever, sell this product these days. And so you mix that. And then there's the fluorescent tracer, which you can buy. These days you can buy small tablets. They're quite relatively safe. Just plonk it in the sprayer, buy a UV light, and you can see exactly where the spray is going. Okay? So I'd like to conclude by saying there's lots of techniques you can do to improve deposition, because that spray that you've bought and paid good money for is not going to work if you blow half of it over the county line and the other half you put on the ground. So select the right droplets, choose the right amount of air, and drive at the correct forward speed to give you time to penetrate the canopy. Don't get carried away by your neighbors in British Columbia who say, gear up, and whatever, I forgot even their catchphrase. It's a lot of rubbish, total rubbish. Where we live, we have woodchuck holes the size of a volcano crater, and we have rocks, the size of this lectern. So you can't go driving around a vineyard at 10 miles an hour. That's crazy. Anyway, so select everything properly and you'll be fine. Remember, common sense beats everything. Thank you very much.
Boy, howdy, that show was good. It was so good, I think we should take this on tour. So we've just run out of time, but this is such an important topic. Let's take a couple questions if y'all have any. I can't use this thing here, so let's not go with this. If y'all want to, anybody got any questions? I think someone had a question about electrostatic sprayers. Yeah, it just says electrostatic sprayers, question mark.
What's your thoughts on electrostatic sprayers?
That's
Electrostatic sprayers, but I think everyone heard me.
the question was, what are my thoughts on electrostatic sprayers? Now, as I retired from the university 4 weeks ago, I don't think I'll stand on a public platform because I no longer have the legal insurance that I used to have at Cornell. But my suggestion to you is, do you think using low application rates, for example, on the ESS electrostatic, 11 gallons per acre, is enough volume of liquid to give you good coverage in any canopy? And our trials at Cornell certainly don't show any value in doing that. And what I would rather see any grower do is to spend good money on fine-tuning their existing sprayer. To that end, I would suggest when you next look at the trial results of an electrostatic sprayer, if you're lucky enough to find any trials carried out in the USA, they're showing me results from Chile. That doesn't wash with stuffy old academics like me. Got to see light with light and compare the same application rate. Run your air blast or your gear moor at 11 gallons per acre and compare it to electrostatic 11 gallons per acre. Be very interesting for you to see. So my answer to you is I wouldn't entertain it. And my colleagues in this field in Europe, we all get together every 2 years and we will share the same opinion. Why Do we think it doesn't work? It doesn't work very well on the east coast of the USA. It doesn't work well on the west coast of Europe. The difference to California, as an example, is California has very different humidity. And so it may well, I've met growers in California with them, and they swear by it. There's the other point, and that's human nature. If you've just spent $48,000 on an electrostatic sprayer, are you going to tell your chums that you just think I bought a bit of a pup? No, you're not. So seeing the wood for the trees is a challenge, and my opinion is spend your money on a better sprayer, because they're out there. Adjustable airflow being one of them, adjustable flow rates being another. Okay. Any more questions?
Are there any other questions? Anyone? Anyone?
Yes, for Jay, not really a question, but more of an agreement with you. From a commercial standpoint, I do a lot of spraying. Management companies, people doing custom work. We have reluctant growers, winemakers that want to minimize chemical rates and extend time periods, and we end up with problems at the end of the season or canopy management issues. And it was glad to hear you say today not to go to those lower rates. It creates problems, and I just appreciate you doing that today.
Thank
you. I deal with some sort of old-timey growers who are very resistant to the idea of spraying during bloom. They insist that it disrupts bloom, it disrupts fruit set. And I've had growers who had disrupted fruit set for whatever reason blame the spraying during bloom. Do you have any comments on that?
From a physiological standpoint, if you think of when fruit set or pollination actually occurs, in most vinifera grapes, it's actually happening before the cap falls off. So the idea that it's disrupting the pollination process is probably a misnomer. We spray during bloom all the time without issues. What could potentially be a problem, though, is phytotoxicity. So if you are doing something like very, very low volume, so problems with the United States is our labels all list rate per acre, 3 ounces per acre. Do you do that in 50 gallons? Do you do that in 10 gallons? Do you do that in 100 gallons? It becomes a concentration issue, right? Where European labels always say X number of ounces and X number of liters, and then you change the liter application as the season progresses. So you're probably dealing, for folks who have probably had phyto or issues with set, it's probably more of a phytotoxicity response of whether it's a certain rate, too low of volume water with too high of a chemical rate during that time period. I don't know if Jay would agree with that or not. But I mean, we've used oil, sulfur, no problems. So there could also be other things going on nutrition-wise, like check all the other boxes first before immediately blaming that, because there are literally thousands of other growers and hundreds of years of data that would probably suggest otherwise.
Yeah, I've not, if you're doing everything right, I don't see that there's any problem with yield problems with spraying fungicides at bloom. I've not really seen any specific research on that being a problem. We've looked at sulfur several years back, and there's just nothing written on that at all. And it tells me that there's probably not a problem. On the other hand, I've seen lots of research saying that powdery mildew at bloom is a real problem for growing wine grapes. Choose wisely.
Okay. All right. Has anyone else got a question? No?
Okay.
Anyone? Okay, well, I'd just like to thank our panel one more time. They did a really great job. And I just want to thank all of you for coming out, and we'll see you next year.